Rome, one of the world's greatest civilizations. A ruthless empire ruling over a quarter of the world's population. An empire built on military might and on the Romans' groundbreaking technology. Their engineering skills created some of the most sophisticated architecture the world has ever seen. They luxuriated in heated baths, had flushing toilets, and even double glazing. Roman technology was so advanced that some claim we still depend on it today. But is this true? Just how much do we owe to the Romans? In 1946, just a few weeks after the first nuclear bomb tests on Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, French designer Louis Réard created a new swimsuit. He called it the Bikini. It was hailed as a daring new innovation, and it caused a worldwide sensation. Few people realized that the Romans had had the same idea 2,000 years earlier. And the bikini is not an isolated example. Many technologies, including strengthened concrete, surgical clamps, and sports arenas, are not modern ideas at all. The Romans got there first. The wonders of Roman technology can be seen in a modern city like New York, vibrant, dynamic, and home to millions of people. As in any 21st century city, the people's lives depend on technology. Central heating, double glazing, bathrooms, and clean water flowing from every tap. New York boasts a sophisticated road system, apartments, sports arenas, and high-tech medical facilities. Yet none of these ideas are new. They were developed by the Romans nearly 2,000 years ago. In many ways, without Roman ingenuity, modern life wouldn't be so modern at all. Around 2,000 years ago, Rome was the heart of one of the world's earliest superpowers. From here, the emperors ruled over a vast civilization that at its height in the 1st century AD stretched from Scotland in the north to Egypt in the south. The Roman Empire dominated Europe for over 500 years, from 31 BC until its fall in 476 AD. But for Rome and its empire to survive, the Romans had to solve many of the same technical problems facing modern cities today. In doing so, they laid the foundations of the future. This is a common modern-day sight. Thousands of fans sitting inside a giant arena, rooting for their favorite team. For the passionate fan, each game can seem a matter of life and death. But back in Rome at the Colosseum, the atmosphere was very much the same. The difference was that there, a sudden death playoff really did mean sudden death. Archaeologist Janet Delane is an expert in Roman buildings.
I think the nearest we can get to imagining what it must have been like to sit in the Colosseum and watch the entertainments is going to a baseball match. The noise, the shouting, the enthusiasm. The one thing that would have been very different would have been the smell, because what you have is real blood.
The Roman Colosseum was opened in 80 AD. It was an elegant building, 4 stories high, 190 meters long, and 155 meters wide. It was big enough to house 4 jumbo jets and had seating for 50,000 spectators.
The Colosseum is the largest of the Roman amphitheatres. If you made it an amphitheatre that was any bigger, the spectators at the back would lose their optimum view. You wouldn't be able to see anything because they didn't have opera glasses. So it's as big as it could be for people to see.
Even by modern-day standards, this was a big construction project. It took around 9 years, thousands of workers, 90,000 tons of limestone, and 270 tons of iron to hold it all together. The inner and exterior walls were all constructed from rock, but part of its structural strength came from the latest and most advanced form of concrete. The Romans did not invent concrete. They borrowed the idea, like many others, from conquered civilizations like the Etruscans, who mixed lime, water, sand, and small stones to make a lime mortar. This would do the job in the short term, but it crumbled with age. Roman scientists overcame that problem by using a brand new ingredient to make their concrete stronger. It was an ingredient forged in the heart of a volcano. Their high-tech ingredient was pozzolana, volcanic ash found on the slopes of Vesuvius in southern Italy. Pozzolana is a mixture of silica, aluminium, and iron oxide, cooked in the volcano's furnace. Its silica is amorphous, meaning without shape, describing how its atoms are loosely bound together. Sand is also made of silica, but its atoms are tightly packed in a crystalline structure which prevents them from reacting with other chemicals. The loosely packed silica atoms in pozzolana react more easily with other ingredients in concrete. Adding pozzolana to lime mortar binds the calcium molecules together. Roman technical wizardry created a versatile mixture so improved that it could even set underwater. The Romans called their miracle product cementum, from which came the modern word cement. They further improved the recipe by adding stone aggregate to the mixture to create a strong, adaptable concrete. Delane believes that this breakthrough revolutionized architecture.
So the mortar that's made with this volcanic sand can develop strength perhaps 5 to 8 times that of the mortar that has been used before this. Now that means that Roman mortar is much closer to modern mortars that are used in concrete.
The Roman engineers used concrete to build the ramped seating and to give the building stability. Supporting the Colosseum's massive structure were 12-meter-deep foundations made from cement and stone. The vast oval seating area was supported by a complex system of radial and concentric corridors covered by concrete barrel vaults. Barrel vaults are arches extending in straight lines to form arcades, which can support multiple tiers of a superstructure. Arches are a key element in Roman architecture. The secret is the way arches support vertical loads, largely by what engineers term axial compression. The load is displaced horizontally over the arch to the sides. The weight rests on the keystone at the top of the arch, which then transfers the load through the arch and out to the pillars. What that created for the Romans was an elaborate honeycomb of arches and passageways. The thousands of thrill-seeking spectators could pour into the amphitheater through 76 entrances, a system much like that used in modern arenas.
Your ticket, your little tessera, had a number, and that took you into a particular section of seating.
The system of entrances and exits was so efficient that the entire building could be cleared in about 5 minutes. A labyrinth of tunnels and cages under the arena's wooden floor housed hundreds, even thousands of wild animals and gladiators waiting to fight to the death. The development of concrete transformed architecture and is one of the most significant technological breakthroughs that the Romans bequeathed to the world. Yet Roman engineering surpassed itself with its crowning achievement, the Pantheon. Some experts believe that this is one of the most important buildings the world has ever seen. Roman technology transformed lime mortar into strong, durable concrete. This revolutionized architecture. But having created this new concrete, the Romans then took it to new levels of ingenuity, unsurpassed even to this day. One example of such before-their-time skills can be found in the back streets of Rome. Architect Mark Wilson Jones believes it to be one of the most important buildings ever built.
This is the Pantheon, one of the world's most amazing monuments. Right. And there we are. It's a spectacle.
Built in 118 AD, this was a temple to gods no one now worships, but it still inspires awe and wonder.
The first time I saw it is just like it is now. You're uplifted. You feel a kind of joy at being in the presence of such an extraordinary thing.
When the Emperor Hadrian's architects began designing a new temple to the 12 main gods of Roman religion, they had to come up with an impressive building. They decided upon a vast dome, 43 meters in diameter. By modern standards, that might not sound big, but in the 2nd century, it was a massive undertaking. A solid dome made from uniform Roman concrete would have been too heavy to support itself. They needed a material light enough and strong enough to span the huge gap. A large dome constantly pushes outwards towards its base, so the engineers built 6-meter thick base walls to support and buttress the dome and stabilize the structure. Next, they built the dome itself. A team of carpenters constructed a wooden framework. Then masons covered it in concrete, which they built up in rings from the base. If they had used normal concrete, they would have run the risk of the structure collapsing when the wooden scaffolding was removed.
Well, the important thing for a dome is that it's relatively weak at the top, and you want to lighten it.
So the Roman masons came up with an ingenious solution. They used lighter and lighter stones within the concrete to reduce the load as the layers got higher.
You want to go for the lightest possible at the top and the strongest and the heaviest at the bottom. So they were carefully graded in sections from the light at the top, bottom, and heavy at the bottom.
For strength at the base, they mixed in large lumps of heavy basalt rock. In the middle were knuckle-sized pieces of stone, and at the top they used pumice, a volcanic stone so light that it floats on water. Finally, at the apex, they left a 9-meter wide hole called the oculus. This avoided a heavy load at the dome's weakest point and also allowed light into the Pantheon's interior. The engineering of the building was incredibly precise. A sphere based on the curve of the dome would fit almost exactly inside the square building. The Pantheon remains one of the greatest buildings ever constructed. Another dome this big was not built for 1,300 years. The Duomo in Florence, constructed in 1420. Even nearly 2,000 years later, the Pantheon is still the largest unreinforced spherical concrete dome ever built. And its design continues to influence architecture across the world. Rome's 2,000-year-old Pantheon is on the left. On the right is the New York State Supreme Court. In the 21st century, nearly 50% of the world's population lives in cities and urban areas. But this style of living is not an exclusively modern invention. Once again, the Romans got there first. Ancient Rome was a thoroughly modern city, with impressive buildings, apartments, and a sophisticated infrastructure to keep it running. The scale of construction impresses Janet Delane.
What's different about the Roman world is the sheer scale of it. The city of Rome perhaps had 1 million people. Now, you don't get cities of that size again until the late 18th, 19th century, at least not in the Western world.
New York is renowned for its skyscrapers and giant apartment buildings. But the idea of high-rise living is not a new one. The remains of Ostia, a suburb housing many of Rome's 1 million citizens, show that Roman architects were the first to solve a problem all town planners face today: lack of space. Roman cities were often built within defensive walls, limiting the room available for building. So like today's cities, the only way to go was up.
Even from quite early days in Rome's history, there were multi-storey apartment blocks. And this develops into a really fine art. There are buildings that have 2, 3, 4, 5 floors, and one very famous one that doesn't survive that apparently had 8 stories.
Once again, the key ingredient was concrete. The architects built strong supporting walls from concrete covered with bricks and tiles. This technique was used to create apartment buildings nearly 25 meters high. To maintain a rigid structure, they built deep foundations, also using concrete. Not only were their apartments multi-story, inside they were laid out much as they would be today. The nicest apartments included a kitchen, a living room, and a lavatory.
Roman urban living underwent the same kind of revolution that happened in the mid-20th century in terms of what we might call mod cons.
What amazes Delane is that 2,000 years on from Ostia, our style of living has changed very little.
It says something about human nature, that you can go from somewhere like ancient Rome with its apartments and really sort of high-density urban living and end up in New York, where they're doing basically the same thing, just on an even grander scale.
For those of us in the West, luxury might mean pristine bathrooms and satellite TVs. But to the Romans it meant something that we generally take for granted: window glass.
I think my favourite thing about the Romans in terms of real inventions is window glass. It's only possible because of the invention of glass blowing, which happens about the middle of the 1st century BC.
The Romans created window glass, but then took a further technological step forward.
As we all know, if you only have single glazing, the heat goes out as the light comes in. So what do the Romans do? They invent double glazing.
Double-paned windows have been standard in modern houses since the 1970s. But in Ostia, there is evidence that the Romans got there before us. Carpenters created a glass support with 2 slots about 1 centimeter apart in which the twin glass panes could rest. This new technology meant light, heat-insulated rooms and was particularly important in another key area of Roman urban life: baths. In recent times, health clubs and spas have become increasingly popular, but once again, the Romans got there first. The Romans were fanatical about cleanliness and bathing and could expect comfortable surroundings with heating technologies still utilized today. Most Roman baths are now merely ruins, but in the ancient town of Bath in the west of England, there remains a fully functioning bathhouse that still operates with Roman technology. In 76 AD, the Romans built the bathhouse around a natural spring that pumps over 900,000 liters of hot water every day. Many buildings around the baths are Victorian, dating from around 1897. But the baths themselves and the plumbing used to move the water around are Roman. still working after nearly 2,000 years. The term plumbing comes from the Roman word plumbus, meaning lead. Roman technicians discovered a way of fashioning lead pipes by molding beaten sheets of lead around a wooden mold. Until it was confirmed to be a health hazard in the late 20th century, lead pipes were still commonly used for water. Roman baths had one other familiar piece of technology: bathrooms.
I'm just entering one of Ostia's public lavatories, and like so much else in the Roman world, this shows a great deal of forethought. Here they have situated the public lavatory next door to the public bath buildings, and that's wonderful because they can use the wastewater from the baths to flush out the whole channel of the lavatory system.
Privacy was not a big deal in Roman times. This lavatory would have been shared by men and women, all sitting next to each other without any sort of partition. But cleanliness was important to the Romans, and while they didn't have toilet paper, they would clean themselves with a wet sponge on a stick. It's not clear, however, whether they carried their own private sponges or if they shared. All these new technologies relied on one vital element, and whether you live in the 1st century or the 21st, it's something you really can't do without: water. Modern cities require billions of litres every day, and the growing demand for water back in year 1 inspired the Romans on to their greatest feats of engineering. As the population of New York City grew to 6 million in the mid-19th century, so did the need for water. New York was surrounded by springs and reservoirs. What it needed was a simple and efficient way of transporting that water to the people. Luckily for New York, the Romans had solved this problem over 2,000 years earlier. At its peak, the city of Rome needed water for about 1 million people, but sources of clean water were at least 25 kilometers away. The Romans needed a way of getting water from the springs in the hills to the city. They did it by gravity. The Roman aqueducts are seen by many as the empire's crowning achievement. By 97 AD, 9 aqueducts carried around 950 million litres of water a day from the mountain springs. Peter Aker studies the importance of water transportation to Rome.
The thing that the Romans did differently from the cultures before them, the people before them, was to deliver water in huge quantities to cities and also to build town life around aqueducts.
He demonstrates how the system worked with a simple model.
We have a model here to show the simple but strict rule of a Roman aqueduct, that water is drawn through the aqueduct by gravity and gravity alone. One end by the source has to be higher than the end at the city, and there has to be a constant inclined plane the entire way down. The water enters the one end of the aqueduct and is drawn by gravity down into the city.
The water in one aqueduct was transported a distance of 50 kilometers, even though the difference in height between the departure and arrival points was a mere 12 meters. The average gradient was around 0.5%. Most of the water flowed through tunnels and troughs. But when the Romans came to an obstacle, or the ground dipped away, they would build raised sections to maintain the correct degree of slope and let the water flow freely.
The part of an aqueduct that I find most impressive is the visible part, the parts that is carried on arches.
Only 45 of the total 420 kilometers of Rome's aqueducts were above ground. The arches were made from a combination of concrete, stone, and brick cladding. Using this construction technique, the Romans could span vast valleys and rivers. The Pont du Gard in France was built around 19 BC. It's 300 meters long, crossing nearly 50 meters above the River Gar. It uses 50,400 tons of concrete and stone, and over the course of the span, it drops just 1 centimeter. The water in Roman aqueducts didn't flow in an open trough on top of the aqueduct, but ran inside a covered channel which protected it from contamination. The remains of these channels can still be seen in cross-sections of ruins. Using only this system, the aqueducts of Rome supplied enough water to fill over 450 Olympic-sized swimming pools every day.
The primary destination, the most important destination, would be the fountains in the streets. That was prioritized. People could have easy access to water.
Today, New York's 8 million residents need close to 4,000 million liters of water a day. The brilliance of Roman technology shows in the fact that 95% of that water comes from aqueducts still running on principles used in Roman design.
One thing, they went to sources at a distance. Secondly, they brought the water down by gravity feed. It was all brought into Manhattan at a slope. And thirdly, to get it into Manhattan, they had to cross the Harlem River, necessitating a large bridge.
In both Rome and New York, the majority of the aqueducts are below ground. It's still possible to explore parts of Rome's ancient Virgin Aqueduct, hidden below the modern city. Built in 19 AD, the Aqua Virgo carried water from the Saloni Springs to the center of Rome, 20 kilometers away. The aqueduct was mainly underground, and at some points went 40 meters below the surface. The tunnel averaged 1.2 meters wide and could carry more than 1,000 liters a second.
This is not an area to be if you're claustrophobic.
The aqueduct traveled directly to the baths of Agrippa and served Rome for more than 400 years. Even though sections of the aqueduct no longer work, rainwater still makes its way into the channel.
What you have to imagine is this channel filled with some of the clearest and coldest water the Romans knew. It was famous for how clear it was, and it would run maybe 3 or 4 feet up this channel here.
The aqueduct was cut into the rock or soil, and the walls lined with cement. Acre can still see evidence of the Roman engineers' attention to detail.
It's fine for that to be rough up top there because the water isn't running full, and they don't care about friction. But here, down here, it is smoother indeed and a much more regular surface. They put a special kind of mortar on the section of the aqueduct where the water flowed to reduce the friction and improve the flow.
A stretch of functioning Roman aqueduct still supplies one of Rome's most famous tourist attractions, the Trevi Fountain. It gushes with water from the same system that once supplied the emperors of Rome. In ancient Rome, the sanitation system created by the Roman engineers cut the threat of disease, even though they never understood the concept of waterborne contagion. But they did appreciate the importance of healthcare, and they had an impressive medical industry that used similar techniques to the one we use today, including anesthetics and even plastic surgery. On a Friday night in New York City, hospital emergency rooms are busy. The medics here rely on high-tech operating theaters and modern pharmaceutical drugs. But many of the ideas and technologies that they use have their foundations in Roman medicine. As curator of Romano-British collections at the British Museum in London, Ralph Jackson is an expert in Roman surgical technology.
I think the thing that most impresses me about Roman medicine is that they achieved so much with so much stacked up against them. There are so many things they couldn't know, and yet the things that they did incredibly well.
Like in modern medicine, Roman medics specialized in different areas and included pharmacists, physicians, and surgeons. There were even anaesthetists who used opium, henbane, and white mandrake derived from flowers and roots. The Romans wouldn't have known it, but henbane and white mandrake are tropane alkaloids and work as anesthetics by blocking the nerve impulses in the brain and neuromuscular junctions. This property led to the discovery and synthesis of the more potent compound novocaine, widely used today for pain relief.
They didn't know what these constituents were, but they knew that these things worked and that you could take a draught and it was perhaps sufficient to put you to sleep.
Their understanding of anesthetics may have been limited, but their ability to design and make surgical instruments was not.
Roman instrumentation lies at the back of all modern instrumentation, and it is spooky sometimes how close those instruments are.
To show just how close Roman instruments are to modern ones, Jackson is showing a replica set of Roman surgical tools to David Rosin and St Mary's Hospital in London.
What is your impression when you see that range of tools?
Well, my first impression is it's pretty comprehensive, and this is obviously a blade or a scalpel. It became what was known as a fleam, which might have been used for bloodletting, but we have very little difference.
Comparing the instruments, Rosin is struck by the similarities.
My guess, and I may be wrong, this is a retractor to hold things out the way. Now, it's a double-ended retractor, and if I'm right, and you're going to tell me if I'm wrong, there isn't a lot of difference between a modern retractor for pulling tissue out the way.
But there is one particular Roman tool which appears to be a perfect match for its modern equivalent.
This is a smaller retractor, similar to your small one, except we were interested to see that we have two different types of retraction. So this is called a cat's paw. Aha, look at that. A cat's paw. Now, really very little is changed. I mean,
look
that's virtually the same, isn't it?
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing.
Instrument after instrument, the surgeon's tools, although made 2,000 years apart, are virtually identical down to the smallest detail.
Absolutely amazed. I mean, virtually no difference at all. And if you think there's 2,000 years difference in time, it's quite amazing.
The Romans used these sophisticated tools to perform procedures that we would consider very 21st century, including cataract operations, brain surgery, and varicose vein removal. They even carried out plastic surgery.
The Romans had a number of operations that we would class as cosmetic. When people got older, the eyelids failed to retract properly. You get a sort of elongation of the upper eyelid. A little sliver of tissue was taken out of the upper eyelid and very fine stitching done. Again, a kind of cosmetic surgery.
The caesarean section as we know it was not performed by the Romans. They used a cruder procedure to remove a baby from a dying mother.
This thing about the caesarean section being related to Julius Caesar and being a Roman technique is completely wrong. Caesarean section was not practiced in antiquity because if they had done, they pretty well knew they would kill the mother.
The Romans' ability to cure illness and save lives was matched by just one thing: their awesome ability to slaughter their enemies. To protect the empire, Rome trained the most disciplined and efficient military force the world had ever seen. And to further improve the effectiveness of this imperial killing machine, they equipped it with the world's most advanced weaponry. Police and armed forces in the 21st century used the latest technology, including bulletproof clothing, riot shields and artillery weapons that can fire lethal shells towards an enemy from several kilometers away. But all of this 21st century technology was inspired by the military machine of 1st century Rome. Historian Kate Gilliver studies how the Roman army conquered half of the known world.
It's the first professional army with soldiers who are professional soldiers. So the Roman organisation, their professionalism, their equipment gives them a huge advantage.
2,000 years ago, the Roman army was the best equipped army in the world. While the architects had mastered the art of manipulating stone and concrete, military engineers had fashioned metal and wood to create devastating weapons of war. The Roman foot soldier's main weapon was a fearsome sword called the gladius. It was a double-edged blade about 45 centimeters long with a sharp point, used at close quarters for stabbing and thrusting rather than slashing. To kill from a distance, they had a spear called a pilum that could be thrown with lethal accuracy for about 30 meters.
Pilum's designed basically to kill. It's designed to pierce people, to pierce armour, to pierce their shields.
The pilum had a 2-meter-long wooden shaft, topped with a 60-centimeter-long iron shank. The tip of the shank was triangular and would have been difficult to remove once it had impaled the enemy. The drawback of any javelin-type weapon is that the enemy could pick it up and throw it back. But Roman military scientists employed the latest metal-making technology to protect their men. The iron tip of the pilum was tempered through rapid heating and cooling, making it hard and strong. But the shaft was untempered, leaving it soft. Upon striking a shield, the pilum's strong tip would penetrate, but the soft shaft would bend, making it useless for the enemy to throw back at the Romans. Protecting their soldiers from injury was just as important as arming them for attack. Early Roman soldiers wore chain mail called lorica hamata. Vertical rows of solid washer-like rings made from bronze or iron were linked to riveted rings that ran horizontally. This chain mail had flaws. It was very heavy, weighing around 15 kilograms, and enemy arrows could penetrate between the rings and injure the wearer. Weapons reconstruction expert Ben Geel studies the impact of Roman weapons.
So it literally explodes through the links and makes its own way.
So Roman armorers came up with a far superior form of protection, articulated plate armor called lorica segmentata, made from a series of overlapping iron plates joined together by leather straps. It was as flexible as chainmail, but 1/3 lighter. The protective shoulder and body pads worn by American football players work in much the same way. The light segmented sections on the shoulders and chest allow movement, but spread the impact of a heavy blow around the body. The lorica segmentata was built to withstand an enemy arrow.
When it went in, only about that far.
The arrow may have made a dent, but the armor would save its wearer from serious injury. And if their weaponry had a modern feel, then so did the tactics they used. Some can still be seen today on the streets of New York. On the 31st of January 2002, facing demonstrations against the World Trade Organization, New York police defended themselves with the latest in body armor and high-tech protection. The use of shields was remarkably similar to something the Romans did 2,000 years ago. The Roman legions knew exactly how to fight heavily armed foes. They used the testudo, Latin for tortoise. Legionaries would bunch together and lock their shields in formation to create a large protective screen. And this formation was as effective in attack as it was in defense. Their large curved shields were made from another modern-sounding material, plywood.
Plywood's very easy to make. You just take a few layers of wood and glue them together with the grain at 90 degrees to each other on the different layers. and that provides a protection that's fairly firm, but that is still a little bit flexible, and that's how they're able to produce these curved shields.
Laminating the alternate layers at 90 degrees gave the shields their strength. If you drop a marble on a thin sheet of wood, it breaks easily. Put two sheets together with the grain in the same direction, and they still break. But if the grains are crossed, the marble bounces off. But it wasn't just foot soldiers who had high-tech equipment. The Romans also wheeled out the big guns.
I think one of the things that impresses me most about Roman military technology is the artillery.
Few examples of Roman artillery survive, but the Romans did leave detailed clues as to how to recreate them. Ben Gile is a member of the Ermine Street Guard, Britain's leading Roman reenactment group. He believes their recreations help us to understand how Roman technology worked.
Before this was done, nobody really knew how these weapons and how this equipment worked. But just knowing how it was constructed doesn't really tell you how it was used, and that's why experimental archaeology like this is very important.
This is the Scorpion. It fires iron-tipped bolts and was used in the first stages of attack and during sieges. It can pierce armor and kill instantly. It works a bit like a giant crossbow. The rigid bow arms are cranked back, storing energy in two vertical skeins made of rope and sinew. Once the bowstring is released, it fires its arrow more than 350 meters at incredible speed.
This is the bolt. That will be placed here. When I release the bolt, you'll see that the wooden shaft underneath it also projects forward, and that acts very similar to the barrel of a gun, keeping the bolt as straight as possible when it leaves the weapon. As you can see, it's fully maneuverable. I then aim at a target, and when I'm happy to shoot at them, I will.
The Scorpion was a lethally effective weapon.
They would have caused devastating injuries. There are skeletons of British people who were probably killed by the Romans when they invaded. There's one guy who had an arrowhead through his spine, another guy who had a catapult bolt through his head, and it went through his skull about here. It must have killed him instantly.
But although it was an effective anti-personnel weapon, the Scorpion was of little use in attacking a building. For that, the Romans needed weapons with a bit more punch. The onager and the ballista.
I think the stone throwers are the most devastating piece of Roman technology.
These pieces of artillery fired large stones at the enemy. During sieges, they would propel projectiles so high into the air that they could break down enemy walls. The whizzing noise of the stones also struck terror into Rome's enemies. To increase the fear factor, they were painted black, so they were harder to see.
It's very effective physically, but it's also a huge psychological weapon, and enemies whom the Romans are fighting are really scared of this stuff.
The ballista works like the Scorpion, but it's bigger and more powerful. It can fire a 30-kilogram stone or a 1-meter-long bolt around 450 meters, allowing the soldiers to stand well away from enemy archers. The speed of the missile is phenomenal, hitting its target at around 185 kilometers per hour. Anyone sustaining a direct hit would be killed instantly. The onager uses a different principle. It catapults football-sized stones weighing around 20 kilograms a distance of 300 meters using a single arm and sling. The vertical arm is powered by a large horizontal skein of rope coiled and twisted to create a rotational force. The skein acts like a spring, storing energy to be released on firing. And the more powerful the spring, the more powerful the catapult. The Romans used rope made from sinews because it was very springy and gave back an exceptionally high percentage of the energy stored in it. Each Roman legion would carry around 60 pieces of artillery. The combination of technology and tactics made the Roman army the premier fighting force in Europe for 500 years and influenced military tactics for the next 1500. We live in a world enhanced by technology, much of it inspired by the Romans. Many modern buildings utilize techniques perfected by Roman architects. Without their development of concrete, many of our famous landmarks may never have been built. The Romans pioneered urban living, building their cities on the same principles we still use today. They even solved one of the greatest problems facing all major cities, establishing a fresh water supply by building a vast water transportation system using aqueducts. They were advanced in medical techniques, and they maintained their empire with the most advanced army of its time. Though the Roman Empire fell over 1500 years ago, much of its technology formed the foundations of our world